Okay, our last bit of the session, quick chat about how to answer questions, some little bit of background to help prepare you. So you need to split every question into the task words, content words, limiting words, and the mark and time allocation. So we'll start with the mark and time allocation. Look at how many marks you can get as a maximum for your question. And as an average rule, you need to answer at a rate of a minute and a half per mark because that's exam timing. Now, you need to be familiar with task words. You'll find this in your textbook and make sure you really are all across this and learn this. They tell you how your answer has to be crafted. So this is words like evaluate, discuss, critically evaluate, identify. For each task word, it tells you a specific structure that you need to follow to get the full marks for your question. Okay. For example, a discuss question means you need to give advantages and disadvantages of a process, where an evaluate task word means you need to state strengths and weaknesses of a process. Now, content words tell you what section of the study design the question is about. So these are directly to do with the part of the study design that you were looking at when you were looking at everything that would be assessed. It's something from the study design, okay? This is why it's so important to work closely with your study design. And the limiting words tell you what not to write. For example, if a question says give one example of something, if you try to give two examples, you've just wasted your time because your response will not be marked past the point of the first example. Okay, so I see some students like get really, really confused and they don't really know anything about the process. They see a limiting word like one example, so they think, oh, the most I can muster is like a short definition or description. So what I'll just do is I'll instead give two examples, but I'll only give a tiny bit of detail for each one because I don't really know either. That student would get no marks or like one mark because they've passed the first example, nothing is going to be marked, and they've barely put anything down for their first example because they don't really know it. So if you see a limiting word like one example, it means give as much detail as possible to one example and don't put a second one down, because past the point that you literally mention a second example, even if you go back to the first and still keep writing about it later on, it's not going to get marked. It's not allowed to get any marks past that point. So just gives you an example. Our task word is discuss, meaning give advantages and disadvantages for this process. Limiting word is to. So we looked at the key personnel. Remember, judge, jury, parties, and legal personnel, the lawyers. So we need to choose two that we are most confident in. For example, two responsibilities that we're confident in. And it asks about legal personnel. The content word, it takes us to the part in the study design where it says you need to know the key responsibilities of all personnel in a trial, and civil in particular. So we can still use, when we say legal personnel, we're talking about the lawyers specifically, okay? And we need to choose two responsibilities. And the mark allocation of 4 marks tells us we should spend 6 minutes on this question. And it also pretty much tells us how much detail we should go into. 2 marks for each responsibility, as we can see. Gives you an idea about the level of detail. So, a little introduction for you guys on task words. Discuss is for and against arguments. Evaluate is strengths and weaknesses, essentially. If a question asks you to what extent, you must state the extent. So you can say things like to a large extent, to a moderate extent, to a low extent, and then that must match what kind of points you give in your body. So if I say to a moderate extent, it means I'm aiming to have pretty much an equal amount of strengths and weaknesses for that process. If I say it does achieve the principles of justice to a large extent, to a high extent, that means my response must border on having more strengths, okay? Because I said to a large extent, it does achieve. Compare questions, you need to give similarities and differences for a process. So for example, compare, um, CAV and Consumer Affairs Victoria and VCAT, okay? And we looked at a table before. I showed you a cheat table. You would need to write about both similarities and differences. Distinguish means you need to write about differences. And you need to use words like whereas, on the other hand. If you don't use any distinguishing word, you will lose a mark for structure. So you can use, try to do it every single time you switch between one thing to another, to just say whereas process B, or on the other hand, process B is different because, okay. And in general, try to signpost your answers in legal studies to make it clear to your assessor that you're doing what the question wants.